On an April Saturday morning, Lucas Hargrove paid $100 at a junkyard and hauled home a car that looked like it had been abandoned for generations. The paint had vanished down to raw metal, rust had eaten through the roof seams, and the license plate could barely be identified anymore. His neighbor, Diana Caldwell, stood by her gate holding a coffee cup and laughed loud enough for half the street to notice. "That's probably the quickest way to throw money away and teach your son to do the same," she said. Lucas didn't answer. He only stared at the car and started working. 5 days later, a famous racing icon pulled into that same driveway carrying a check worth $5 million. What could possibly have been hidden beneath all that decay? Keep listening to this story, because the truth was something nobody on that street ever expected. Lucas Hargrove was 34 years old, living the sort of life that never looked impressive in photographs. Every morning at 5 he woke up, packed Wyatt's school lunch, checked the handwritten timetable hanging on the refrigerator, and walked into the converted garage behind the house where he worked as an independent mechanic. Most of his customers came through recommendations. Usually, the money was enough to survive. On the months it wasn't, Lucas kept that fact to himself. His wife, Sarah, had died 2 years earlier in a highway accident. The driver responsible survived without serious injuries. The hospital debt Sarah left behind did not disappear so easily. Lucas paid it little by little, quietly, without asking anyone for pity. To most people on Marlowe Street, he was simply the quiet man with the pickup truck and the young son. They weren't exactly wrong. They just never knew the full story. Wyatt was 7 years old, missing one front tooth, and completely attached to a stuffed bear he carried everywhere. Sarah had named the bear Bolt on the night Wyatt was born because she had loved racing, loved the smell of oil and the sound of engines at full speed. The bear had already lost one button eye and had been sewn back together twice using different colored thread. Wyatt never cared. Lucas rarely spoke about Sarah. If Wyatt asked about her, Lucas answered honestly, but he almost never shared memories on his own. His grief had settled deep inside him like sediment beneath still water, hidden below the surface but always there. Elijah Cross was Lucas's only close friend in the neighborhood. At 40 years old, Elijah owned a small repair shop near the end of Marlowe Street and had the rare ability to know when someone needed conversation and when silence was enough. Some Friday nights, he brought sandwiches over, and they ate together in the garage while Wyatt finished homework beside the workbench. Wyatt called him Elijah instead of sir or uncle, something he never did with other adults. Diana Caldwell had moved onto the street a year and a half earlier. Her house had a black front door, a spotless white Audi in the driveway, and flower boxes that somehow always looked perfect. She was 31, worked in real estate, and lived according to standards she had never formally explained but followed with complete certainty. Diana wasn't intentionally mean. She simply spoke without filtering her thoughts. In 18 months, she and Lucas had probably exchanged fewer than 40 words. Once, with a smile that almost seemed polite, she suggested he might be happier in a different kind of neighborhood. Lucas looked at her briefly and walked back inside. She took it as rude behavior. He considered it the simplest response possible. Marlowe Street was the kind of place where news traveled faster than logic. The houses were close together, windows facing directly into one another. People walked dogs slowly and watched everything. Anything that happened in one driveway became neighborhood conversation by the next day. Carter Voss had owned Voss Auto Salvage for more than 30 years on the east side of town. The lot sat behind chain-link fencing and smelled faintly of oil and transmission fluid. Carter was 60, practical to the point of bluntness, and priced cars mostly by instinct instead of research. The morning Lucas arrived to buy a carburetor for a customer, Carter was busy clearing out a large group of vehicles from a storage property whose lease had expired. The estate manager wanted everything gone before Monday. Carter wanted quick cash. Neither cared much about history. Lucas was walking past the back row when he noticed it. The car sat in the far corner beneath part of a rusted metal roof that looked ready to collapse. It was a black two-door coupe, or at least it had once been black before time, and weather stripped it down into peeling patches of rust and exposed steel. But something about its shape stopped him cold. The wheelbase was too long for a car that size. The windshield angle was sharper than anything from that era. Even the wheel arches looked hand-shaped instead of machine-made. Without touching it, Lucas could already tell this wasn't ordinary. Someone had spent years thinking about this machine before building it. Before he even realized it, he placed his hand against the rear quarter panel. The metal felt cold beneath the rust and dirt. Underneath, he could feel bodywork that hadn't been stamped by factory equipment but shaped carefully by hand. The difference was subtle, but for a man who had worked around cars his entire life, it was unmistakable. Carter walked up beside him. "That one's $100, he said. "Take it today or it gets crushed Monday morning." Lucas stood there silently for a long time. He thought about Wyatt's shoes that had been too small for over a month because money kept getting delayed. He thought about the electric bill waiting on the kitchen counter. He thought about how impossible it would be to explain why he suddenly cared about a destroyed car he knew nothing about. Then he handed Carter the $100. Before towing it home, Lucas opened the driver's door to inspect the interior. As he did, a tiny piece of an old sticker peeled loose from the door frame and drifted onto the ground. He picked it up and slipped it into his pocket without examining it carefully. For some reason, it felt important. The trip home looked ridiculous. Elijah's pickup truck pulled the rusted coupe slowly through town with a rope, the dead steering causing it to drift slightly side to side. They reached Marlowe Street around 9:40 that morning, and by the time they pulled into Lucas's driveway, several neighbors were already watching. Curtains shifted. Kids on bicycles stopped moving. Even a man walking a retriever paused at the corner to stare. Diana was standing at her gate. Lucas hadn't noticed her when he first turned onto the street, but somehow she had appeared at exactly the right moment. He heard her laugh. He heard another neighbor quietly laugh with her. Then he heard the words, "Poor kid." The words didn't hit Lucas directly. They landed somewhere near Wyatt, who was standing at the edge of the driveway still wearing his backpack after hearing the truck arrive. Lucas didn't react. He parked the truck, stepped out calmly, and said to Wyatt, "Go grab my tool bag." Wyatt glanced once toward Diana, not angrily, but carefully. Then he looked at the car with the same tilted curiosity Lucas had shown at the salvage yard, like he was trying to hear something hidden inside it. Without another word, he went inside. Lucas started unhooking the tow rope slowly and calmly. He wasn't pretending to stay composed. He genuinely was composed, the way someone becomes after surviving pain much heavier than a neighbor's opinion. That night, after Wyatt fell asleep, Lucas began working. He set up 2 work lights in the garage, switched on the small radio sitting between the tools, and started cleaning the car carefully from the bottom upward. While wiping grime from the driver's floor area, he uncovered a chassis number stamped into the metal underneath. He stared at it for a long time. The format didn't match any VIN structure he recognized. The prefix began with the letters R, A, and C, followed by numbers and additional letters unlike anything he'd seen before. Lucas photographed it and spent 40 minutes searching online. He found almost nothing. One obscure reference mentioned a European racing registry from the early 1970s using similar prefixes, but the exact code led nowhere. He texted Elijah, "You ever seen a chassis prefix starting with RAC 67? 11 minutes later, Elijah replied, "Nope, go to sleep." Lucas ignored the advice. Instead, he removed the sticker fragment from his pocket and held it beneath the work light. Most of it had disintegrated with age, but part of a logo remained, a stylized wheel beside a sharp flame design. Lucas didn't recognize it immediately, but something about the symbol felt deliberate and professional. It didn't look like decoration for an ordinary road car. He carefully taped the fragment onto clean paper and went inside. The next morning, Elijah arrived before sunrise because Lucas had called him at 6:45 and simply said, "Come see this." Elijah spent 5 full minutes underneath the car without speaking. When he rolled back out, he looked both worried and excited. "The frame's been reinforced by hand," he said quietly. "Not factory work. Somebody welded support gussets onto every joint. That takes months. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Then he opened the damaged hood and leaned closer into the engine bay. "Lucas, this isn't stock. The block's been custom machined by hand." He straightened slowly. Whoever built this car had serious money and serious skill. Lucas had already photographed the suspension. The geometry was wrong for a normal street car in exactly the way that suggested custom racing setup. Even the springs appeared specially fabricated. Later that afternoon, Lucas joined a vintage racing forum online, an old-fashioned site filled with longtime enthusiasts who had probably been using the same usernames for decades. He uploaded pictures of the chassis number, suspension setup, body lines, and sticker fragment, then explained exactly what he had found. By the next morning, the thread had exploded with 47 replies. Some users insisted it was an ambitious custom build from the 1980s. Others weren't so certain. One member named Garage Legend TX wrote, "If that chassis number is real, you may have found something this community's been searching for over 15 years. Another user sent him a private message. "Stop posting photos publicly, seriously." Lucas printed every page of the discussion and stored them in a folder. That evening, Wyatt sat in the garage on his usual overturned bucket while Lucas polished the rear body panel. "Does the car have a name yet?" Wyatt asked. Lucas smiled slightly. "Not yet, want to give it one." Wyatt studied the car carefully, tilting his head just like his father had done in the junkyard. Then he said, "Bolt." Lucas froze for a moment before quietly replying, "That's a good name." And then he kept working. On the 4th day, Lucas noticed the paint on the passenger side B-pillar felt thicker than the rest. Using fine sandpaper, he slowly removed the black layer and uncovered metallic blue paint underneath, a very specific shade he vaguely recognized from old racing photographs. Now he worked with extreme care, like an archaeologist uncovering history. Then he found it. Hidden inside the pillar where the closed door normally concealed it was a stamped marking pressed directly into the steel itself. Not a sticker, not a plate, a permanent factory impression. A number. Beside it, a stylized signature made of 3 connected letters. Lucas photographed it and searched for 3 straight hours. At 2 a.m., he finally found a match buried in a digitized automotive magazine from 1983. The article described the collapse of a legendary racing team from the American Southwest, known for groundbreaking endurance technology during the 1970s and early 80s. According to the article, several prototype vehicles had supposedly been destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1983. One paragraph near the end mentioned a missing development prototype, an experimental chassis that had never officially raced, but had quietly influenced endurance car engineering for years afterward. The car had been presumed destroyed. It was never seen again. The stamped signature belonged to Marcus Webb, the team's lead engineer, who had died during a test accident in 1982. The team itself had been owned by Dominic Ashford. Lucas remained in the garage until sunlight slipped beneath the door the next morning. Elijah never intended to tell anyone, but eventually he told his wife because keeping the secret felt impossible. She told another neighbor. That neighbor told her husband and the man with the retriever. By morning, the entire street knew something unusual was happening, even if nobody said it directly. Neighbors suddenly appeared at Lucas's garage with ridiculous excuses. One asked to borrow a tire gauge. Another claimed to be searching for a lost cat. Both spent more time staring at the covered car than speaking. Lucas finally draped a blue tarp over it. After hearing the rumors through multiple people, Diana learned a simplified version of the story. The rusted car Lucas bought for $100 might actually be worth millions. She laughed at first. Then she opened her laptop. She searched Dominic Ashford and spent the next 20 minutes reading article after article. She found photos of a thin, white-haired man standing beside priceless vehicles at auction houses. Financial magazines estimated his fortune at over $1 billion, built through racing victories, automotive investments, and historic car collections. Buried near the bottom of one article was a small detail. For more than a decade, Dominic Ashford had been privately searching for a lost prototype vehicle from the early days of his racing career. A prototype everyone believed had burned decades ago. Diana slowly closed the laptop and stood silently at her kitchen window, staring at the blue tarp in Lucas's driveway for a very long time. That afternoon, Diana knocked on Lucas's front door carrying a measuring cup, explaining that she needed to borrow a kitchen appliance. Lucas opened the door, listened quietly, and replied, "I don't have one." Then he shut the door, not harshly, just with the calm finality of someone who had already decided exactly how much effort this conversation deserved. Diana remained standing there for a second before turning and walking back across the street. Late on the fourth evening, an email appeared in the inbox connected to Lucas's Racing Forum account. The sender was Giselle Hartman, whose signature identified her as executive assistant to Dominic Ashford. The email was brief and direct. It explained that Mr. Ashford had seen the forum discussion and the photographs Lucas had uploaded. It stated that if Mr. Hargrove truly possessed the vehicle described online, Dominic Ashford would like to meet him personally. The message added that a meeting could be arranged within 24 hours at whatever time Lucas preferred. At the end, it simply asked him to confirm. Lucas sat at the kitchen table reading the email 3 separate times, his palms flat against the wood surface. Then he stood up, walked back out into the garage, lowered himself onto Wyatt's overturned bucket, and called Elijah. "You awake? It's 9:30. Dominic Ashford's office just contacted me." Silence. Then Elijah said slowly, "Say that one more time." Lucas repeated himself. Another pause followed, longer this time. Finally Elijah asked, "What are you gonna do?" "I'm not sure yet." Lucas glanced toward the blue tarp covering the car. "I just needed to tell somebody first." "You told the right person," Elijah answered. "Now reply to Giselle Hartman. You're meeting them tomorrow." The fifth morning happened to fall on another Saturday, which felt either meaningful or accidental depending on your perspective. Lucas woke up at 5 as usual, brewed coffee, and made breakfast for Wyatt even though there was no school. Routine held their lives together, and Lucas rarely disrupted it without reason. He chose the best flannel shirt he owned, dark green with no visible stains. For a brief moment, he understood how ridiculous that decision probably looked from the outside. Still, he wore it anyway. Over breakfast, Wyatt asked, "Is somebody important coming today?" Lucas answered, "Maybe." Wyatt looked thoughtful. "Is Bolt staying?" Lucas studied his son for a second before replying quietly, "We'll see what happens." Elijah arrived at 9 in the morning without needing an invitation, because he understood that certain moments in life deserve witnesses. He brought coffee in a cardboard carrier and wore the expression of someone trying not to reveal how much he hoped for a good outcome. At exactly 10:00, a black Cadillac rolled slowly to the curb in front of Lucas's house. Lucas stood in the driveway waiting. Halfway down the street, Diana Caldwell watched from behind her living room curtains. She had already been standing there for 20 minutes, the coffee in her hand long since cold. Dominic Ashford did not look like a man often caught off guard. He was 58 years old, lean in the way physically active people stay lean for life, with close-cut white hair and hands marked by decades of real work. He stepped out of the passenger side without ceremony and walked directly toward the garage like someone who already knew exactly where he belonged. Then he saw the car. Giselle Hartman followed behind him holding a tablet, remaining respectfully off to the side. Elijah stood near the garage entrance, close enough to observe but far enough to avoid intruding. Dominic slowly circled the car. He moved around it exactly the way Lucas had in the salvage yard days earlier. Occasionally, he extended a hand to touch the surface lightly. For a long time, nobody spoke. Finally, Dominic stopped at the rear quarter panel and stood motionless. Quietly, he said, "I thought this was gone forever." Lucas looked at him carefully. "You know this car?" Dominic turned toward him for the first time. "I built it, 1971, nearly 2 years of work. It cost me more than money ever could." He glanced back at the coupe. "In 1983, they told me it burned in the warehouse fire with everything else." He paused slightly. "And honestly, I needed to believe that." He crouched near the passenger side B-pillar and stared at the stamped signature hidden in the steel. After a long silence, he rested one finger against it and stayed there without moving. At last he spoke again. "Marcus Webb was my lead engineer. He died during a test accident in 1982. Dominic's voice remained steady, though quieter now. "This car never raced officially. It was only a prototype. We built it to prove a chassis geometry theory Marcus had spent 4 years developing. The theory worked. It influenced endurance racing design for the next decade and a half." He stood slowly. "Marcus signed every structure he handcrafted. He used to say engineers should sign their work the same way painters sign a canvas." Lucas asked, "If it survived, what happened after the fire?" Dominic shook his head. "I honestly don't know. Someone must have moved it beforehand, or maybe it wasn't there that night at all. I hired people to search for it twice over the years. Eventually, I stopped looking." Then he looked directly at Lucas. "How did you even find it?" Lucas told the story exactly as it happened, without exaggerating anything. He explained that he'd gone to the salvage yard searching for a carburetor. He explained how the coupe had been sitting forgotten in the back row waiting for the crusher. He explained how something about its proportions had stopped him in place. Dominic listened, without interrupting once. When Lucas finished, Dominic asked quietly, "Why buy it? To anyone else it looked worthless." Lucas thought carefully before answering. "I can't really explain it properly. There was something about the lines, the shape. It looked intentional, like somebody had spent years thinking about it." Dominic stared at him steadily. "Marcus said nearly the exact same thing the first time he showed me the original sketches." The garage became completely silent after that. Not an empty silence, but the heavy kind that settles when something deeply true has been recognized. A moment later, Wyatt appeared at the garage doorway holding Bolt the bear beneath one arm while gripping the frame with the other hand. He didn't step inside immediately. He just watched. Lucas turned toward him. "Come here." Wyatt walked carefully to his father's side. Dominic looked down at the boy. Wyatt looked back at him, then at the car, then back again. "Dad named it Bolt," Wyatt said softly. Dominic's expression shifted slightly in a way only attentive people would notice. He looked at the coupe again, hearing the name. Then he smiled faintly. "That's a good name." Wyatt thought about that seriously before asking, "Did you miss it a lot?" Dominic remained silent for a few seconds. "Yes," he answered quietly, "very much." Wyatt nodded once. "My dad says that's how you know something matters. You miss it." Giselle stepped forward and handed Lucas the tablet. Displayed on the screen was a number, $5 million. Beneath it sat a straightforward purchase agreement. One page. Simple. Dominic spoke calmly. I don't negotiate things like this. That's what the car is worth to museums and to me. But you can say no. You don't need to decide today. Lucas looked down at the number. Then he looked at Wyatt. Then back at the car itself, the curved rear panel, the shape of the body beneath the garage lights, the steel that had somehow survived 4 decades. He didn't answer immediately. That night after Dominic and Giselle left, Lucas sat alone in the garage for a long time doing absolutely nothing. Wyatt was inside watching television. Elijah had remained for about an hour before leaving quietly, wise enough not to force a conversation before Lucas was ready for one. Lucas thought about Sarah. She used to keep a sketchbook filled mostly with drawings of cars. Not technical blueprints, but loose sketches drawn by someone who loved machines emotionally rather than mechanically. One drawing appeared again and again in slightly different forms. A long, low coupe with sharp windshield angles and hand-shaped wheel arches. Lucas had looked at those sketches hundreds of times without realizing what she had been drawing. Now he understood. Maybe Sarah had never seen the car directly at all. Maybe she had only imagined it from stories and photographs. He thought about Wyatt choosing the name Bolt without knowing any of this. The bear, the car, the same name arriving naturally through the instincts of a 7-year-old boy in a quiet garage. Eventually, Lucas picked up his phone and called Giselle Hartman. I have one condition, he said. One condition, and then my answer is yes. Giselle replied, go ahead. The car gets displayed publicly, not hidden in somebody's private collection. People should be able to see it. He paused briefly. And on the display plaque, I want Marcus Webb's engineering explained in a way normal people can understand. There should also be a line saying the car was identified and restored by someone who saw value where everybody else only saw rust. You don't even have to mention my name if you don't want to. Giselle answered immediately. I'll tell Mr. Ashford right now. Lucas waited in silence. 8 minutes later, she called back. He agrees to everything, she said. And he wants to add one more thing. He wants Wyatt's name included too. He said the car has a name now, and the boy who gave it that name deserves to be remembered with it. Lucas covered his eyes with one hand and sat quietly in the dim garage for several seconds. Then he whispered, tell him thank you. The next morning, Diana Caldwell stepped outside without her usual coffee cup. Lucas noticed immediately from the kitchen window, because it was the first time in 18 months he had ever seen her empty-handed. She stood near her gate, while the flatbed transport truck carefully reversed into the street. Lucas walked outside to supervise the loading, while 2 restoration technicians secured the undercarriage with almost reverent care. Then Diana crossed the road toward him. She stopped a few feet away and tried to speak. I didn't know, she said awkwardly. I mean, how could I? Lucas looked at her calmly. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction. It's okay, Diana, he said quietly. Next time somebody believes in something, maybe give it 5 days before deciding it's worthless. She opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. Lucas turned back toward the car, while she slowly walked away behind him. Wyatt stepped onto the porch wearing pajamas and holding Bolt the bear. He watched silently as the car was loaded onto the transport truck. Then he lifted one hand and gave a small, solemn wave. Lucas noticed it from the corner of his eye and suddenly felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. 3 weeks later, the money appeared in Lucas's bank account in one transfer on a Tuesday morning. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the number on his laptop screen for a very long time. The very first thing he did was call the hospital billing department and pay every remaining dollar of Sarah's medical debt in full. The entire phone call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, Lucas simply said, "Thank you," and hung up before the administrator could continue talking. Afterward, he sat silently for a while. For the first time since Sarah's death, the financial weight she left behind had completely disappeared. The feeling wasn't victory. It felt more like opening a window during winter after months of stale air. Suddenly, the room felt lighter, different, alive again. He bought Wyatt new shoes, the exact pair the boy had once stared at in a store window 6 months earlier without asking for them. He also bought Wyatt a detailed building, set modeled after a classic endurance race car. "I thought maybe you'd like building one yourself," Lucas said while handing over the box. Wyatt studied it for several seconds. "Can we build it together?" Lucas smiled softly. "Yeah, this weekend." Later, he called Elijah and told him he wanted to put money into the repair shop, not as some formal business arrangement filled with paperwork, but simply as support between friends who trusted each other completely. Elijah argued for a minute out of principle, before finally accepting for exactly the same reason. Together, they agreed to expand the garage, install another lift, and train an apprentice mechanic. The remaining money went into a school assistance fund named after Sarah. It was designed to help children whose families carried burdens invisible in school photographs. Lucas refused the ceremony invitation when the program launched. Instead, he mailed a signed letter and quietly declined to give a speech. 3 weeks later, Giselle Hartman invited Lucas and Wyatt to the opening of a new exhibition at the city's Transport Museum, a gallery dedicated to American endurance racing history. At the center of the exhibition sat the fully restored car. The paint had been returned to the original white-blue shade Marcus Webb chose in 1971 because, according to a handwritten note discovered in an archive, he believed white-blue looked like the color of things moving faster than they should. Lucas drove Wyatt there on a Thursday evening. Wyatt wore his new shoes and carried Bolt tucked beneath his arm. Dominic Ashford greeted them personally when they arrived. He shook Lucas's hand first before crouching down to Wyatt's level. Inside the gallery, the car stood under carefully balanced lighting on a raised platform where every angle could be admired. It looked extraordinary, like something imagined decades ahead of its time and hidden from the world for 40 years before finally returning to daylight. The information plaque beside it described Marcus Webb's engineering clearly and honestly, the years of work, the revolutionary geometry, and the influence it quietly had on racing history. Near the bottom was a sentence explaining how the car had been rediscovered in a salvage yard by a man who recognized something special in its proportions when everyone else overlooked it. And below that, in smaller lettering, the vehicle was named Bolt by 7-year-old Wyatt Hargrove, who said it was the right name, and it was. Wyatt stood silently in front of the car for a long time. Then, without turning around, he asked softly, "Dad, is Bolt happy here?" Lucas looked at the restored coupe and thought about Marcus Webb spending years building something he believed in. He thought about 4 decades hidden in a salvage yard. He thought about a 7-year-old boy listening to a shape nobody else noticed. Finally, Lucas answered quietly, "I think so. More people get to see him now." Wyatt nodded once. "That's good." Then he reached for his father's hand. "Can we get food after, the kind with the dipping sauce?" Lucas smiled fully, the kind of unguarded smile that appears before you realize you're allowing it. Several people nearby noticed it without understanding why it mattered. "Yeah," Lucas said softly, "whatever you want." By the following month, a "For Rent" sign stood in front of Diana Caldwell's house on Marlowe Street. Officially, she told neighbors the commute to her new office had become inconvenient. That explanation was true as far as it went. Nobody on the street spoke badly about her. Because the strangest kind of justice in life is rarely loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's simply the permanent weight of words you can never take back once people have heard them. Lucas kept the garage. He kept the small radio between the toolboxes. He kept the 5 a.m. mornings, the handwritten schedules, the Friday night sandwiches with Elijah, and the quiet routines that had always held his life together. He didn't become a different person. He simply became a steadier version of the man he already was, someone who now understood with certainty that the most valuable things rarely announce themselves loudly, and that the distance between worthless and priceless is often nothing more than whether somebody chooses to stop and truly look. Sometimes late at night in the garage, Lucas still spoke to Sarah silently in his thoughts, not from grief exactly, but because real love never fully ends. It only changes shape. On those quiet nights, he often imagined Sarah would have recognized the car instantly in the salvage yard. She would have walked directly toward it without hesitation, rested her hand on the rear panel, and smiled softly before saying, "I know this shape." And Lucas believed she would have been proud of Wyatt for nomming it. But most of all, he believed she would have been proud of him for seeing something valuable in a rusted car worth only $100 to everybody else.